Right. So that's one of the ways it worked long ago. And let's see if we can bring up another way it used to work. Ooh, what's this? My goodness. There we go. Here's another way. Signals communication was sent a long distance. Semaphore flags. Not quite sure how they work, but I guess different poses. Flat, flat, flat. Arms up, arms sideways. Meant different letters. And I love to read British Navy novels from the Napoleonic Wars. Horatio Hornblower's one whole series by an author. His last name is Forrester. And there are others that are wonderful. I don't know if you've seen the film Master and Commander, which is based on another big series of wonderful novels. But the way ships in those days would communicate amongst a fleet, for instance, when they were pretty far away, they could be half a mile or a mile away from each other. The ships would post different colored flags, which meant different basic things, stay in harbor, venture out to attack the enemy, whatever it is. So lots of visual ways to communicate, at least, a mile or two, and then the signal could be relayed to other people. And that was long distance communication. Another way, out in the West, how the West was won. I don't know if you guys have heard of the so-called Pony Express. I believe the Wells Fargo company, now the Wells Fargo Bank, which has had its own share of unfortunate happenings of late, you may have read about, with bank employees opening fraudulent accounts because of management pressure to meet unrealistic goals. Anyway, I digress. The Pony Express out west, before the telegraph, before railroads, these men would, you see the mail bag in the back there, the saddle bag on this horse, there'd be a relay kind of horses set up every, 50 miles or so. And these men would ride and then change horses and then ride a fresh horse and then change horses and ride a fresh horse. And so could go at horse speed, more or less 30 something miles an hour, I guess, to take written messages over long distances. Yeah. But then we decided to get electronic. And as I said earlier, Samuel Morse, who was actually a painter by trade, set up the first full telegraph system and got a patent for it in the U.S., even though others in Europe, for instance, had been doing things with telegraphs. So the story is, as you see here, in 1825, he lived in the New York area, and New York City paid him to paint a portrait of Lafayette, the French citizen who came to fight in our Revolutionary War alongside George Washington and Hamilton and others who fought in that war. And so he was in Washington, D.C. doing a portrait because Lafayette was in Washington, D.C. posing for it. While he was painting, it says that a horse messenger delivered a letter from his father that said, "Your dear wife is convalescent," meaning not well. And he got another letter the next day, again by a horse messenger, saying that his wife had died. He got on a horse or got in a carriage and used 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 horsepower to leave Washington, D.C. to go back to New Haven, which is where he lived, New Haven, Connecticut. He did not finish the portrait of Lafayette. And by the time he arrived, and it would have taken several days, his wife had already been buried. Because in those days, you didn't mess around and delay things like that. So he was heartbroken. He had been unaware of her failing health, unaware of her death. And so, the story goes, he decided to figure out a means of rapid long-distance communication, which ended up being the telegraph. This is an early telegraphic key, and it taps. It sends tapping sounds over wires, potentially hundreds of miles. The first telegram was sent January 6, 1838, across 2 miles of wiring between New Haven and I think it was a post office or something, very close. And the message that he tapped out by a Morse code, which he invented: "What hath God wrought?" The word wrought, as in W-R-O-U-G-H-T, not R-O-T, wrought, is one that we don't see very often. We see it with the word, I want to say playwright, I want to say wheelwright, W-R-I-G-H-T. This is someone who, with some craft, makes something, and this is what the meaning of the word is. Basically, it's what has God done? What has He made? And giving the credit for this amazing breakthrough to God. Here we see a very early photograph of someone who is putting up telegraph wire, probably along a railroad track bed, because the invention of the steam engine, which I think we talked about somewhat in our newspaper class, led to locomotives and the laying of railroad tracks all over the place in Europe and also in the United States. So that now, rather than once these railroads started going in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, 60s, you didn't necessarily have to climb on a horse to go somewhere. You could get in a railroad car and go. But anyway, the right of way that these tracks had to have to be put down, they had to cross a lot of private property, and people just had their property taken, I think, by eminent domain for the railroad. It meant that there was now a clear line where you could put the wires for telegraph. You can see here, during the Civil War, 15,000 miles of telegraph wire was laid purely for military purposes. And President Lincoln, the person we talked about in the newspaper lecture, who used newspapers to communicate to his public by sending a letter to the editor, every morning, I think pretty much the first thing he'd do upon waking up in the White House was to put on his stovepipe hat and hopefully his pants and his frock coat and a pair of worn-out boots, very big worn-out boots because he had huge feet and hands, and walk down to the telegraph office. There was a special office in Washington, and troops far afield would do their best to report in via the ... Morse code as to what was happening with a battle or with whatever they were up to. And of course, the rival armies would try to cut the wires of each other and disrupt communication. But this is how Lincoln got news from the battlefield. One way of communicating that I forgot to show, I probably should have. If I had, I would have done it. I just thought of it. I would have done it via a shot from Game of Thrones. Can you guys, anyone out there, if this were a live class, I'd say, how many people were religious watchers of Game of Thrones on HBO? And I probably would see some hands go up. And then if I asked what was the primary method for long distance communication in the show Game of Thrones, what would the answer be? Okay. Okay, so Western Union was a company that dominated the telegraph business. In 1866 to the year 1900 was Western Union's heyday. You can see yearly messages increased from 5.8 million to 63.2 million in 1900. Not everyone had a telegraph set up in their home, of course. It's not the way it worked. That was for later, for the telephone. You can see that most telegraph offices were at locations like post offices. You see here railway stations, governmental stations, stock exchanges, very few nationally distributed newspapers, the largest internationally important corporations, and some wealthy individuals. So the senders and takers of the messages were limited, but you could send a message to the Western Union office to a person, and then Western Union, someone would deliver it that final mile, as Amazon says. So the person would get a wire, a telegraph to open. And you could send all over the world that way to an individual person. Speaking of sending all over the world, you can see here that the telegraph wire went from Newfoundland on the left all the way under the Atlantic, 2,000 miles almost, to the United Kingdom, to Ireland, and then to Britain. And the first wire was, and sometimes it was put down more than 2 miles. This was in the I want to say the 1840s. One of the first message was President Buchanan sent a message, to Queen Victoria, who sent back a message. Now, the first wire, actually, that was the cable that was laid, actually was not hardy enough to last. It didn't last more than 6 months. The same fella who put down this original cable a year or two later did it again with a tougher cable, with a tougher coating, et cetera, and this one lasted. And so now, rather than news from Europe taking 2 months on a ship crossing 2,000 miles of the Atlantic, it was a dish, dash, and communication was more or less instantaneous between the two continents. And this is an early telephone, folks. This is not a picture of Alexander Graham Bell. It's an actor who evidently played Alexander Graham Bell. And we don't talk too much about this early telephone here, but obviously we will be getting to mobile phones later. So the invention of the telephone in the first place is pretty important happening. Alexander Graham Bell is credited with setting up and doing the first phone system and the first phone call. And the first telephone system that was set up in the U.S. was, interestingly, done in New Haven, a pretty busy little town, New Haven. So in 1877, this fellow Coy, who lived in New Haven, got a franchise from Alexander Graham Bell for New Haven and Middlesex counties in Connecticut. They established the District Telephone Company of New Haven, 15th January 1878. They had to build a switchboard. In this case, you can see it was more or less kind of cobbled together, I think you could say. It could handle as many as 64 customers. Only 2 conversations could be handled simultaneously, and 6 connections had to be made for each call. And they started with 21 subscribers, each of whom paid $1.50 per month, which actually was a fair amount of money in those days. I think you could get a cup of coffee for a couple of cents. So $1.50 a month was a fair amount of money in 1878 or 1880. Well, here you go. So this one, first telephone directory was published in 1878. 50 subscribers were listed. Most of these were businesses, physicians, police, post office. Only 11 residences were listed, 4 of which were persons associated with the company, the District Telephone Company of New Haven. So this is the beginning of the telephone reaching out across